So in this tutorial, we're going to look at measuring trends in resource consumption, including individual, national, and global ecological footprints. And so the first thing is that I think we're all aware, is that we are consuming resources at an incredible rate. And in some statistics tell us that in the last 30 to 40 years, we've consumed more than a third of the world's resources. And that doesn't take a rocket science to realize that that is unsustainable and that actually that is finite and that the world is heading towards no good place if we continue at that rate of consumption without dramatic systemic change. So you could pick out any resource you want. If we look at the top right here, we're looking at natural gas consumption. The first thing we see, look, the global north is the big consumer of natural gas, the global south much smaller, North America the largest region consuming natural gas. The bottom right looks at coal consumption, and of course look at the size of China there. China's still predominantly using coal for its energy. And again, a kind of a global north versus global south pattern. So in terms of energy and carbohydrate use, well, we're significantly using these up, and there's a global north and a global south picture. When we start to broaden that and start to look at different types of mineral, different types of resource, well, China is by far the biggest consumer of most of these kind of commodities. So look here, we've got different aluminium, nickel, zinc down at the bottom, oil, natural gas, less of that. Huge consumer of most kind of metals, resources, and that of course is going into its manufacturing for a massive population as well as the global demand for commodities. And so actually some of that kind of consumption of resources, a large amount of that consumption of resources, is actually our own demand for these resources through our consumption. So the next graphic I want to look at, is this StockTech graphic, brilliant kind of timeline of these finite resources. You can see that the ecosystems are more resilient, that they go around the circle. They take us up to here, look, Brazilian rainforest, 196 years. If we just stop that and think 196 years left of tropical rainforest, that is incredibly worrying. But our finite energies, look, 2050, we can see that they'll be kind of reaching their kind of end of production, and then here precious minerals, varying degrees of kind of limited amount, getting through here to 80 years with aluminium. So these are finite resources that are not going to last. They are going to run out. We are consuming them at incredible rates. So ecological footprint is this measure of the resources the resource use that's used to sustain our economy and our social way of life. So it goes into our housing, it goes into our mobility, it goes into our resource consumption, and ecological footprint measures that impact. Countries can use this to indicate the level of resource use and the environmental impacts that their economy has. And then they can use that as a way of improving and reducing their impact. It's normally presented in terms of a global picture. So if everybody lived with the ecological footprint of an individual living, let's say in Wales, how many planet Earths could we use? How many planet Earths would be needed to sustain everybody? And this is the global picture of ecological footprint. And you can see here, look, the size of the area is increased based on the amount of resources which they require. And here in green, we've got, well, these are kind of positive measures, but going down to the dark reds where we have worryingly high ecological footprints. So USA in particular, look here, with a large population, a very high level of consumption. Those two things combined make that very, very worrying picture. Look at how large the United Kingdom is here. Not quite at the same kind of impact as the USA, but significant all the same. That little dot there is Luxembourg. A big picture, of course, a much smaller African continent here, a much smaller South American continent, to represent much lower levels of ecological footprint. If we see that actually in real data, you can see in this graphic the kind of the same sort of patterns. So this is represented here, the numbers, so ecological footprint in proportion to the average worldwide capacity available per person. So here you've got 400% higher than actually the worldwide average capacity. Lower levels in Europe, significant levels in Australia, the Eurasian region, really quite high levels again. And as we see here, much lower levels across China, the South continent here, South America, and the lowest levels found in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. So that gives us a really interesting picture of the global distribution of ecological footprint. It can also be looked at the national scale. So Switzerland use ecological footprint as an official indicator for their sustainable development monitoring, and they've been doing so since 2008. This represents their footprint in 2012, and you see predominantly it's the biggest component is their carbon emissions. A smaller component, Switzerland being kind of a mountainous country, large areas of rural areas, so their built up land doesn't take up too much space. But agriculture does, grazing does, and forestry and the use of wood resources also having big impacts on its ecological footprint. So that's really quite useful. You see where a country can target improvements by seeing this type of measurement. And without measured data, you can't identify where your consumption lies, and therefore you can't target how to improve it. This kind of feeds into this bigger picture, really, in terms of actually Earth's capacity to support humanity. And so this is ecological footprint over time, so our ecological footprint rising. And we've kind of reached this critical point here. So we've got this idea of kind of an overshoot where, we can take this path, business as usual, as we call it, make limited changes to our ecological footprint and our carbon emissions. And this is what we'd need to support that. Clearly, we'd need 2 planets. But even if we do make changes, 30% reductions in carbon emissions, we still need a planet and a half. So to get back down to a stable point, we need to make dramatic changes. And ecological footprint can measure that for us. To put that into kind of ecosystem terms as well, the world has a carrying capacity. If we exceed that carrying capacity, we overshoot. And then that leads to a degrading, in terms of the carrying capacity, a reduction of the Earth to support and to carry our activity. And so this is a really important concept. Look where we are. We are clearly in overshoot. We are currently degrading our carrying capacity, and there is nothing sustainable about that. And this is a really interesting graphic, isn't it, about the country overshoot days. And so actually, in terms of like our consumption in a year, if everybody in the world lived and consumed like those in Qatar or Luxembourg within the year, the carrying capacity would run out. We'd reach overshoot by the 11th and 16th of February. Indonesia here having the best overshoot, but still not making the year, running out on December the 18th.